Hi class, this is Sir Alex Basco and this is our lesson for General Biology 2. This is our first lesson for the fourth quarter. Today we are going to start our discussion in lesson 6 beginning with the first part of 6.1. And we are going to discuss the structure of various vascular plants as well as their growth and development. So at the end of today's lesson, what we want to be able to do is for you guys to be able to actually compare and contrast the following processes between plants and animals: their reproduction, their development, nutrition, gas exchange, transport, circulation, regulation of body fluids, chemicals and nervous control, immune systems, and sensory motors mechanism. So as you can see, this goal is actually quite big. So in order for us to be able to do this, the first half of the fourth quarter, we are dedicating it in study of plants. And then the second half would be on animals. So the first half of the second quarter, we are all going to be dealing with everything about plants, from their reproduction, development, structure, various processes that includes their nutrition, gas exchange, transport and circulation, etc. So beginning our study on plants, in the first part of 6.1, we are going to talk about the various organs, tissues, and cells that we can find in plants. So let's start with understanding the organizations of plants. More specifically, the structural organization of the plants. Like animals, plants also has cells, tissues, and organs. Cells are basically the fundamental unit of life. We've discussed this. This is the smallest possible living part of an organism. And if you grab various cells together and put them together in such a way that these cells function together in a specified way, they become tissues. And again, if you gather all these tissues, put them all together in such a way that these tissues function on again together in such a very specified way, we get organs. So that's the difference. Or basically that's what constitutes cells, tissues, and organs. So again, basically cells is the most fundamental unit of a living organism. If you group them together in such a way that they perform a specialized function, then they become tissues. And if you gather all the tissues, put them all together in such a way that they function at a particular specialized function, again, you have your organs. So today we are going to talk about different organs, tissues, and cells found in plants. So for plant organs, we are going to talk about their roots, stems, and leaves. As for the tissues that encompasses or basically creates these organs, we are going to talk about thermal tissues, vascular tissues, and ground tissues. And lastly, we are going to talk about the most common plant cells available or that we know of, which includes the parenchyma cells, collenchyma, sclerenchyma, which are the main cells, and then two more specialized cells called the water conducting cells that is found in xylem, and the sugar conducting cells that are found in phloem. So this is the summary of what we are going to discuss today. So let's start our discussion with the plant organs. Basically, plant is the morphology of plant includes two very distinct morphology: the shoot system and the root system. And from these, we can actually see the evolution of plant, or tracing these functions. We can see the evolutionary morphology of plants in such a way that they actually gather sources of nutrients from two different places. One is above the ground and the second one is under the ground. And these organisms, or these plant organisms, have been evolved in such a way that they can utilize and gather nutrients from above the ground, which includes the sunlight and the carbon dioxide, and below the ground, which includes various minerals and the water. So Again, when we talk about plants, when I talk about something like I mentioned shoot, then I'm talking about the portion of the plant that you see above the ground. And if I'm talking about the root system, I'm talking about the parts of the plants that are underneath the ground. As for shoot system of the plant, the main functions includes photosynthesis, transportation of food and water, reproduction, and storage. Because you can find the part of the plants that utilizes photosynthesis or uses photosynthesis to create those sugars and various food for the plants, which are basically found on the leaves or the green coloring of the leaves, which is the chlorophyll. The shoot part of the plant is also responsible for transporting various food and water. More specifically, since photosynthesis happened here, it is important that the plant can actually transport food from the shoot to the root system, because the root system cannot actually photosynthesize. So there's no sunlight underneath the ground, so they cannot create what we call the sugars which they need in order for them to survive. So the plant can actually transport these various sugars that they created via photosynthesis downwards to the roots in order for the plant to survive. The same way is true for the root system. There's no way for the plants to be able to gather water or be able to sip water above the ground. So the root system is actually designed in such a way that they absorb waters and minerals and be able to transport those food and water, more specifically that water, above through the shoot system. And we are actually going to talk about that, which is part of the transport system of the plants. But again, let's go back to the basic vascular structure of plants, beginning with the organs, and more specifically beginning with roots. I'm probably sure you guys have idea already what root does. This is the main organ of the plant that anchors the plant to the soil. When we talk about anchoring, it's the one that stabilizes the plant onto the soil in order for it not to be toppled. And depending on how big the roots are, or how deep they can go, the stronger that anchorage a plant can have, and the stronger they can what's that word? The stronger that they can survive in various situations, for example, like storms. But again, the root is the organ that its main function is one of its main function is it anchors the root, or it anchors the plant onto the soil. Another function of roots includes absorptions of various minerals and water found underneath the ground. Also, it functions as a storage for carbohydrates and other reserves, more specifically carbohydrates or sugars that were created via photosynthesis and transported onto the roots in order for the root portion or the root system of the plants to have carbohydrates in order for it to survive. And there are things that I want you guys to remember about roots. There's what we call the primary root and the lateral root. The primary root is basically the first root that comes out of the seed. So if you think of a plant, you usually think about them in terms of starting as a seed. So when a seed breaks forth and the root starts to go down, the main portion of the root that starts to go down is called the primary root. And every other root that comes out or that branches out of that primary root is what we call the secondary root or the lateral roots. And for this type of system for plants, most of the water absorption is actually happening via the lateral roots. The lateral roots contains what we call root hairs, which elongates. So if you actually look much closer, these lateral roots here, they have much smaller roots that is actually responsible for most of the water absorption and the mineral absorption that the plant needs in order for it to survive, that are found underneath the ground. And there are different types of roots. There's something what we call the taproot and the fibrous root. So the taproot is much a better anchor. So if you look at the picture right here, if you see plants that has a taproot system in them, the primary root is much further and it anchors much better than plants that have what we call a fibrous root, wherein it's more branches instead of having the primary root going much deeper. The difference between the strength of these two is it's much difficult to pull out or to topple plants or trees that have tap roots, while for plants such as grass, if you actually try to pull out grass, they're much easier because they don't have the tap root. They only have fibrous roots that extend in much more various ways, and its function is more increase surface area for more absorption, while for taproots its purpose is not only for water absorption and mineral absorption, but for also for anchorage. As for taproot, it is actually more energetically unfavorable, meaning it needs more energy for the plant to have this type of root, but sometimes they rather use that energy for the taproot in order for them to have a better anchorage, because if you have a fibrous root, it's much easier for you to pull out, and when the time comes that there's much storm, plants with tap roots are more likely to survive than those with fibrous roots. And lastly, that I want you guys to remember about roots is what we call the mycorrhizae, or the mycorrhizal associations. Mycorrhizae or mycorrhizal associations is basically a symbiotic relationship or association between the plant roots and the fungi found in the soil. And this association between the plant roots and the fungi is actually beneficial to the plant because it actually increases the water intake or the mineral and the water absorption for the plants to grow and to survive, and in order for it to have the nutrients necessary for survival, growth, and development. So it's something that I want you guys to remember. Mycorrhizae, again, is a symbiotic relationship or association between the plant roots and the fungi found in the soil. Next, let's go on to the second organ of the plant, which we call the stem. The main function of the stem is to bear leaves, or it's the organ that bears the leaves and the buds of the plant, and you usually found the stem on the shoot system of the plant, or the portion that is found above the ground. So its main job is to actually elongate and maximize sun exposure for photosynthesis. Again, like you've mentioned, the shoot system of the plant is designed in order to utilize carbon dioxide and the sun energy or the sunlight for photosynthesis. The organs, this organ system or the stem organ of a plant is designed in order to maximize that ability of the plant. So it elongates, it goes higher to reach further in order for them to be much more exposed to sunlight. Another function of the stems is it actually elevates the reproductive organs. I hope you guys know by now that flowers are actually part of the reproductive organs of the plants, and a lot of their pollens that can be transported via wind or insects such as bees and butterflies, those seeds that the plants has in order for it to pass on to their genes into the next generation, are all found on the stem, and which is found on the shoot system of the plant. If you actually look at the stem, it's actually composed of what we call the nodes and the internodes. So it's an alternating system of nodes and internodes. So nodes are the portions of the plants wherein the leaves grow. So for example, this portion right here, and this here are where the plants grow, and that part of the stem is what we call a node. And the portion in between the nodes, so you have your node here and another node there, This stem part is what we call the internode. So it means it's the intermediate between the two nodes. So that is the basic part or the basic structure of a stem. So having said that, now let's talk about the leaves. The leaves is the third organ of the plant, and its main job is for photosynthesis. So basically, the job of the stem is to elongate the plant in order for the leaves to actually reach higher and have more access onto the sun, because the more surface area or surface exposure that the leaves have, in order for them to get sunlight, the more they are that they can utilize their photosynthesis ability to create various products such as oxygen that we breathe in, as well as food that we can eat in, more specifically carbohydrates or sugars. Also, another job of the plants or the job of the leaves is for exchanging gases, dissipation of heat, defense from prey, and various pathogens or diseases. So exchange of gases, intaking of carbohydrates, and releasing of oxygen happens on the leaves of the trees or plants. Also, the trees uses leaves in order to dissipate heat, especially in summer, and if the plants is not suited for much warmer areas, they usually release some of their heat via the leaves. We're not going to go yet into detail. We're just looking at the various functions of these organs. The leaves also has defense mechanism against prey. For example, some leaves has like a scrub structure. I'm not sure if you guys have seen that. They have like hair-like structure that you can find on their leaves, which helps prevent various insects that might eat the plant on going onto the plant because of those structures. So leaves has various uses for plants for their survival, not only for photosynthesis but also for their survival. Leaves is also composed of what we call the blade and the petiole. So the blade is basically the leaf itself, and the petiole is basically this right here, so the one that is connected onto your stem. Remember what this part right here, this is the node right here wherein the leaves is shooting off from the stem, and connected onto the stem is what we call the petiole, which connects the blade of the leaf onto the stem. So that is the part of the leaves, and we have different types of leaves. Actually, we have what we call a simple leaf and a compound leaf. A simple leaf is basically direct what you would immediately think of when you think about leaves. It's a simple blade with a petiole attached to the stem. While a compound leaf, you would have a much longer petiole and what we call a leaflet. So on the petiole, there are various blades, which we call leaflets, attached onto the leaves. And there are various types of compound leaves. You have something like this, and you have another type wherein it's much more complex in design. For example, instead of having it this way, all of the leaves are connected, creating what we call like a look like what a star may look like, but that's also compound leaf. But we're not gonna go yet into detail into those, but just know that there are various types of leaves, simple and compound. So let's go back onto the stem, which I forgot to discuss. The stem also has a part which what we call the auxiliary bud and the apical bud, the apical meristem or the apical bud. The apical bud of the stem is basically the part of the stem that continues to grow, and it is found at the topmost portion of the stem. While the apical bud that is found on the stem is the portion of the stem that can actually grow either onto a leaf or actually onto a branch. So they're usually found on the node, and they can grow again in either as a leaf. So as you can see right here, this a auxiliary bud right here can grow into another leaf, or it can actually start and form another branch. Okay, so those are the organs of the plants. Now let's go on to the various tissues of the plants. So let's go, we've gotten the whole organ of the plant. Now let's go on a little more closer, which is a combination of tissues which creates all of these organs. So the first tissues that we are going to discuss is what we call the dermal tissues. So the dermal tissues functions is that it serves as the outer protective layer, or basically the covering of the plant which protects it. It's very similar with our skin. Our skin, or our dermis, is actually the outer covering, is an organ which is the outer covering which separates us from the external to our internal condition. And it is very important because it's not only serves as because it serves as a protection. There's actually dermal tissues actually consists of what we call the epidermis and the periderm. Let's just remember that we're not gonna go deep into detail the difference between the two, but something that I want you guys to remember is cuticle. So basically dermal tissues or epidermis is what you would found on very woody plants. So for example, the outer covering of your massive, for example, the trunk of the tree is an epidermis, but for cuticle is much a waxy type of epidermal tissues, which you can actually find in leaves and stems. So for example, you have your leaves here and you have your stems, and this is the dermal tissue, which more specifically a cuticle, which is a coating. So as you can see here, you have your cuticle here and you have your dermal tissues, and both of these is basically the protective covering of your plant. And then you have what we call vascular tissues. Vascular tissues is what is the tissues used by the cells for transporting materials, which includes the system which pulls water from the ground into the root system, into the shoot system of the plants. The same with the conduit or the transport system, where plants transports its sugar or carbohydrates made via photosynthesis from the leaves onto the stem, onto the roots of the plant. So those tissues responsible for that are what we call the vascular tissues. Moreover, since as you can see it's for transporting materials, therefore you usually find them on the stem. So another function for vascular tissues or for mechanical support. There are two types of vascular tissues that we are going to talk about. One is xylem. Xylems are vascular tissues which are responsible for conducting water. Another type of vascular tissues is what we call a phloem, which is the one necessary in order to transport sugars or the carbohydrates, which I've just discussed earlier. So if you look here, so you have your outer covering of your plant. So this is your plant, and if you cut it open, you would see something like this. If you actually zoom in, for example, on a microscope, you would see your dermal tissues, which is the outer covering of your plant, and then you would see your xylem and phloem inside. As you can see here, you have your xylem and phloem inside, because these tissues are the ones responsible for transporting materials. And then there's another third type of tissues called the ground tissues. Basically, ground tissues are tissues that are neither dermal nor vascular, and they are divided into pith and cortex. Cortex is basically located to the outside or around the vascular bundle. So this is your vascular bundle here. These are your xylem and the phloem, and the cortex or the ground tissues cortex are found outside. So as you can see here, this ground tissue right here is what we call the cortex ground tissue, and then you would also find a ground tissues found in the center of the stem along the xylem and the phloem. It's not drawn here, but it's you can still find ground tissues in here, and the ground tissues here is what we call a pith. So more specifically, just remember that ground tissues are basically you may think of them as filler tissues. Filler in such a way that it just fills up the plant. They do not have exactly a very specialized function. It's just that it fills out the remaining part of the plant. So those are the ground tissues. So those are all the tissues that we find in plant. Now let's go on discussing the various cells that we may find in this dermal, vascular, and ground tissues. So dermal, vascular, and ground tissues are basically tissues composed of various cells. And the cells that you may find in these tissues include these following common plant cells. Number one are parenchyma cells. Parenchymal cells are basically the living cells of the plant. And one important part of parenchyma cells is that they are unspecialized, meaning they can actually adapt to different they can actually adapt and differentiate for various functions of the plant. So you may think of this as, for example, a fetus. So when a baby is developing, it starts as a blob of cell, and that cell is undifferentiated. So when we talk about differentiate, is that a specific cell changes into a more specified cell that has a function. So again, let's go back to the analogy of the fertilized egg, which is the zygote, which is just a bunch of cells. And as that cells continues to divide and develop into a much more into billions and trillions of cells to create the fetus or to create the baby, some of the cells specializes in such that they become cells that function is that are necessary for organs. For example, cells becomes cardiac cells, which are the cells in your heart. Some becomes epidermis or epidermal cells, which are cells that we may find on your skin. So when various cells differentiate, or it basically becomes from an unspecialized, when we say unspecialized, it doesn't have a very specific function. So when it moves from an unspecialized cell to a much more specialized, more specific functioning cells, then it, what we call it, differentiate. So again, so going back, parenchyma cells are basically cells that are unspecialized or undifferentiated, and plants can use these cells to move them in such a way that they need. Maybe they need it to create collenchyma or sclerenchyma cells, which has more specific function. So the cells, plant cells uses their parenchyma cells to create the specialized cells. Next, we have the collenchyma cells, which are elongated cells with irregular thick walls that provide structure and support. And one thing about the current collenchyma cells are that they may provide structure and support, but they're very flexible in such that they do not restrain the growth of the cells. So even though it provides structure and support for the plants, it does not hinder or it does not stop the growth of the cells. Another cells we are going to talk about is what we call the sclerenchyma cells. They're very similar with collenchyma cells in that they also function as a support. But more specifically, sclerenchyma cells function as a more rigid support. So most bulk of woods that you see, those hard pieces of wood, those are more specifically sclerenchyma cells, and they're thick lignified walls. Lignin, right here, so word here which we call lignin, is a polymer that is a very strong, or it gives that plant, or it gives the wood that very hardy structure. So the cells that were lignified and eventually they actually die. When sclerenchyma cells mature, they basically die. They create those very hard covering of your plants, the trunk of the tree, and more specifically sclerids. Sclerids are types of sclerenchyma cells that you may find in nutshells and seed coating. So if you guys have eaten peanuts, peanuts has outer covering. So if you have open almonds, the shell that covers that nut is a type of sclerenchyma cells. It's very thick. It's a function of support, and it's very rigid. Another example of sclerenchyma cells are fiber cells. So fibers, for example, if you guys seen had abaca ropes, or if you've seen flax fibers, these are sclerenchyma cells, and as you can see, they're very rigid in such that we can actually use them as ropes. If you guys have seen loofah, those are also examples of sclerenchyma cells. The one that you can use to scrub your body as you wash, you can buy them. So they can come from various plants and fruits and vegetables. I forgot the type of vegetables that they use for loofah, but what happens is that when the fruit starts to grow, and a lot of loofah production is that they just let that fruit grow and grow, and the cells starts to die, and what's left is that crisscross patterns of loofah, or crisscross patterns of fiber cells that are very strong and very rigid, which we can use to scrub our body for cleaning. So those are the various common types of plant cells. So these are more specifically what I want you guys to remember, and then the remaining two are just a little bit more about the xylem and the phloem. So xylem and phloem, water conducting cells, which are basically the xylem tissues. So in the xylem tissues, you will find the water conducting cells, which are tubular and elongated cells, and when they die, they actually become lignified as well, similar with sclerenchyma cells, and they leave these thick walls that water can flow into the plant. So from the roots onto the shoots. So if you look inside in the phloem or the xylems are composed of these elongated, rigid, lignified walls that can basically the water can go up to. And some examples of these cells are tracheids and vessel elements. And lastly, we have the sugar conducting cells in the phloem. So as opposed to the water conducting cells, the sugar conducting cells, which are the phloem, which are also found in the vascular bundle of your plant, they are actually alive at functional maturity, which is opposite for water conducting cells, where when they mature, they actually die off, leaving this wall structure. But for the sugar conducting cells, until maturity, they are alive, and they look like also narrow cells, and they allow transport of sugars, which is a product of photosynthesis, to areas of the plants. The cells that we call examples of these sugar conducting cells are sieve cells. So those are the various types of the cells that you will find in your plants. So finally, we've discussed the organs, the tissues, and the cells that are found in the plant. So that's all for now. We are going to discuss part 2 on our next lesson, which is more specifically with the growth and the development of the plants. I hope everything is clear. If you guys have any question, do not hesitate to ask anything. May you guys have a great day. Thank you so much.